So it's really beautiful to be here, and I feel honored, actually, to be invited to be the closing speaker in this conference. And I just came today. I have to admit, I didn't really know too much about the purpose movement or what was sort of happening here. So it's been really exciting and enlightening to see the focus, and also just to feel kind of like the thought envelope in the room, the field of inquiry and so on. Yeah, I'll just talk about my work a bit, and hopefully we'll have a little time for Q&A. We'll see if that works out. As my first book, as he mentioned, is Breaking Open the Head. That book came out in 2002, kind of before the latest psychedelic renaissance. And the genesis of that book was my own existential or spiritual crisis. I was working as a journalist and a magazine editor in New York, and I'd grown up as a scientific materialist, and my worldview was a rational, skeptical worldview. And I began to feel this kind of the icy tendrils of nihilism, clutching my soul. And I wondered if there was anything else, or any way to discover if there was anything else. And I remembered my psychedelic experiences in college as being the most significant kind of suggestive experiences that seemed to say that consciousness had many gateways, many dimensions, that there were huge pieces of the puzzle that weren't really being allowed into contemporary discourse. And so that led me on the quest that resulted in the first book, Breaking Open the Head, where I went to the West Africa. I went through an Iboga initiation with the Bwiti tribe. I went down to the Amazon and worked with a tribe called the Sequoia, taking ayahuasca. I visited the Mazatec Indians in Mexico, where we rediscovered the mushrooms of the 1950s. And many other experiences, discovered the Burning Man Festival and the whole world of psychedelic research chemicals and so on. And over a course of experiences, I had many kind of transpersonal experiences, many psychic experiences, telepathic experiences, synchronicities, and my worldview was forced to change and evolve to allow in this new information, this new influx of information. And I ended up kind of shifting from being a Freudian materialist to a Jungian occultist in a way, really accepting that there are these other psychic dimensions, there are probably other layers of spiritual being that interact with our world in different ways. And it was a very profound transition to go through, and it left me really recognizing that I couldn't trust anything in my culture that my culture said about the world. That if we had, if my culture at that point totally dismissed our culture, dismissed and ridiculed psychedelics. You weren't even allowed to talk about them publicly. In the New York Times, called them jokes or toys of the hippie generation. You couldn't talk about the psychic experience. You still really can't. You couldn't talk about mystical experience, in the mainstream, and I realized that this suggested there was that our paradigm was very, very off, and our system was very, very off kilter, because these experiences were obviously, having had them, tremendously important, tremendously valuable. And that led me to write a second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. As I'd been doing the first book, I began to learn about the prophecies of ancient and indigenous cultures, like the classical Maya and the Hopi and even the Hindu prophecies of the Yuga cycle. And I kind of essentially, spent a number of years kind of trying to find a language, because indigenous cultures speak in their way, but we live in the modern Western world, and I was sort of trying to find the juncture points, which involved looking at a lot of Western philosophy, looking at people like Heidegger and Nietzsche and Rudolf Steiner and Carl Jung again, and Jean Gebser, an Austrian philosopher, and kind of trying to build a bridge between these indigenous ways of understanding time and prophecy and consciousness and evolution, and where we are in our modern world. And so for me, each book has been fueled by this deep kind of a sense of urgent questioning, like something that I was like, it's almost like I would look around the culture and I was like, where is that thing that I need to read to understand, or to understand what's happening? And if I couldn't find that thing anywhere, then maybe I have to write it myself, because who else is going to do it? So. The 2012 book basically argued that I never put, it wasn't about that date in particular. It was about there being this invitation or opportunity or this opening to understand these indigenous cultures and to integrate that knowledge in a deeper level, and to recognize that we clearly are going through this time of tremendous planetary transformation, that seems to be something like an evolutionary process, really, if you consider the rapid, accelerated evolution of our technologies, the way that we've now meshed our whole planet together into one global brain, these kind of layers of accelerating developments, right? First we had industrialization, well, first we had agriculture, then industrial civilization, then the communications revolution. So it's like we've moved rapidly into this global scenario where now we're clearly meshed together in one global brain where billions of people are able to communicate with each other instantaneously. And at the same time, this has led to kind of a opening up of the esoteric traditions of cultures around the world, from Amazonian shamanism to Tibetan Buddhism to Zen to Sufism, to the point where we can see that these esoteric traditions really all share a set of understandings and values that sort of are coherent. And then also, I believe, crucially important is the evolution of science and technology to the point where we can now see correlations between, quantum physics and Eastern mysticism. It's almost like this new paradigm is almost just emergent that anchors the mystical understanding in an awareness of what quantum physics tells us about the nature of consciousness and so on. So those are some of the facets of what I see as this emergent new society, emergent new paradigm, and also one of them is what we're facing ecologically, which is a global mega crisis that threatens the future, our own future, and the future of all life on Earth. And it was that really became the subject of this new book, How Soon Is Now, which has actually taken me 10 years to finish. I kept trying to write it and getting to a certain point, and it sort of collapsed on me and so on. And I do think it's a useful book for people who are part of this purpose movement, and I do hope you'll give it a read, check it out. I have some copies here. And the book was really an effort to consider what could we do next? Like, how would we put our world back together in different ways? I guess there's some main themes of the book and ideas like to first bring out. And one of them is that we can look at the ecological crisis that we're facing as a species as something like an initiation or a rite of passage for humanity, collectively, individually and collectively, let's say. And we know that every traditional culture around the world had initiations that marked kind of the separation between adolescence and adulthood. And those initiations often involved ordeals, vision quests, going out into the wilderness, sun dances, using visionary plants like ayahuasca or peyote, and they forced the individual going through the initiation into transpersonal states, visionary states of consciousness, and kind of obviously out of their comfort zone, kind of breaking the bounds of the egoic self-identity. So when they came back into the community, the elders would be the ones who would be there to welcome them back, to kind of interpret their visions, to give them a context, and then sometimes those visions would be important for the whole community, and they would be acted out or performed or integrated into the evolving knowledge of that community. And modern civilization really did away with initiations and rites of passage. One question is that is that really problematic? Because perhaps Joseph Chilton Pearce wrote a book called The Biology of Transcendence, where he basically argued that these initiation experiences are not just cultural passages; they may almost have like a neurobiological function, where perhaps our brains, the part of our brains that makes us mostly distinctly human is the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to process abstract symbols, to use language, to plan for the future, and so on. And while this obviously develops innately, it kind of traps us in this kind of separated egoic identity, unless there's a kind of shock that could be cultural or through an accident or something that leads people to have that more larger context, that transpersonal experience. where they can then see it's not just, it's not just me, it's a we, so that they're actually, they're part of this continuum, they're part of the tribe as a whole, and so on. So in a sense, without that, in our society, you could say that to a larger extent, instead of having adults, we have kidults. We have people who go through maturity, but they haven't had that inner confrontation or inner development, and therefore they maintain themselves as entirely self-interested. And who's the most promising, who's the most obvious example of a kidult that we see around us right now every day? I mean, we have Trump is obviously, and we're, it's almost like a collective shadow projection or manifestation of this culture at its apex, at its perhaps its final expression in that sense. So one of the ideas of the book is that collectively humanity is undergoing a rite of passage to go from the adolescent state of immaturity that we're now in to an adult state of responsibility and maturity, where we go from kind of focus on our individualistic goals to focus on our, on cooperation, on collaboration, and participation. And we're really, I think, in the crux of that now. And as a result of that kind of rite of passage, I believe that we will sort of make a transition where we will become aware of ourselves as, as elements or expressions of planetary superorganism. That humanity as a whole, as a species, is like a gigantic superorganism that exists in a symbiotic relationship with the ecology of the Earth as a whole system. And as we anchor that understanding, I think that will necessarily make a lot of differences. We'll change our systems, our social systems, our technical systems, to reflect that new understanding. But the question is, how do we go about that? I mean, when I finished the 2012 book, and the book was quite metaphysical and looked at the kind of occult aspects and the psychic aspects. But then I was like, all right, like we can talk about the age of Aquarius or conscious evolution or the new age, but what does that actually mean? Like, how do we actually bring about the more beautiful world that we know in our hearts is possible, as Charles Eisenstein says? What would that actually look like? How do we even think about such a thing? And it's such a big issue, and we're not really trained to look at our situation in that comprehensive and systemic way. In fact, our education systems are designed to make people hyper-specialize and to sort of, so somebody becomes an expert on, one facet of a gene in one insect or something, or one species of plant or something, but we don't have people who are kind of, comprehensive generalists. One of the people who deeply inspired me in writing the book was Buckminster Fuller, the design scientist, who wrote some really tremendously amazing works in the 60s, such as Utopia or Oblivion or Operation Spaceship Earth, where he really felt that like we were in a design crisis, that humanity had been, the way we'd learned to design things is like we've been trying to dominate or control natural systems, and actually what we should be doing is learning from nature and imitating its principles. And he believed we'd reach a point where either we were going to create a utopia for humanity as a whole, a world where our whole human family benefited and where we collaborated in that sense, or we wouldn't make it as a species at all. It would be too easy for individual groups to get hold of tools of tremendous destruction or whatever might happen. And I think that book is still very profound and very salient to this moment, where it really does seem that we're in the crux of that emergence and emergency. And Buckminster Fuller said that really, that was what we had, our genius as a species, was that we had that ability to be comprehensive generalists and to think systemically. And he was really a systems thinker and put that out as a model. So that I tried to kind of apply that in the book, and it took a level of I guess a lot of time to reach that level of abstraction. It's almost like trying to look at our world as if I was like an alien anthropologist from like another planet or something. And I think from that perspective, I began to see that there were the three main areas we would have to address to bring about this transformation in the time that we have available before it's too late. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's been a very high-minded conference. I tend to take a few minutes to just mention the ecological kind of data. Do people want to hear that? Or is it like, we don't want to hear that, right? Okay, so like we're losing something like 150 species a day. They estimate out of 8 million-ish total species on the planet. So that means we're losing like 10% of the Earth's biodiversity every 10 to 15 years. Which obviously we can't sustain for too long. And that's partially because the most biodiverse places on the planet are being deforested, turned into soybean plantations, and so on. You know, we don't know how fast climate change will go. Some estimates are 4 degrees Celsius warmer by 2100, but actually we also know from past epochs of climate change that it can go faster because there are a lot of feedback loops in the climate system that get engaged at certain point. And so in the time of the Permian mass extinction, there was at one point a 10 degrees Celsius increase in just a decade or so. You know, we know, for instance, there are these large deposits of methane that are frozen in the Arctic and the Siberian peat bogs, and as that thaws, that methane gets released, and you know, CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for about 100 years. Methane only lasts in the atmosphere for 10 years, but it's like 30 times more potent as a heat-trapping gas than CO2. So if it erupts in large quantities, it causes a rapid warming cycle. Yeah, and we can see these feedback loops are happening now. So for instance, we have you know, major forest fires happening all over the world. You've been having them in California, obviously. And as the ice caps reduce, that also leads to a loss of the albedo effect. It was actually the whiteness of the ice caps reflects the sun rays into space and keeps the planet warmer. So the problem is that these feedback loops start to pick up. So we're definitely in, you know, we don't know how much time, but we have a threshold, you know, a period of time where you know, we have to sort of repurpose our technical genius and our creativity to make this ecological situation our primary focus as a species. And so then the three areas in which we would think about that, I believe, we can think about the technology, infrastructure, the technical side of it, the social system side of it, like the political government structures and economic systems, and then lastly, the consciousness part of it, which is beliefs and values, ideologies, and how those create patterns of behavior that become reinforced. So for me, that became like my three-tiered, you know, structure, kind of like three wheels that are all turning each other, right? So you have the technical systems are areas like industry and energy and agriculture, maybe are the biggest three. And in those areas, what's great is that it's very clear. We know what we would have to do in a short period of time. You know, so for instance, we know that we would have to transition to renewable energy as fast as we possibly can, not in like 50 or 100 years, but maybe more in like 20 years. And there's actually, and what's exciting is that there's nothing technically preventing us from doing that. There's nothing physical preventing us from doing that. It's just a question of mobilizing that much human will that quickly. Yeah, and at the same time, we also know that we would have to radically reduce CO2, something like scientists say like 8–10% per year, which, you know, we would also have to admit that we would have to rise to that occasion and see that that would actually require significant sacrifices on the part of the general population. People would have to be thinking about traveling less, eating less meat, using less consumer goods, and so on. So that sounds very negative. It's not something that people really talk about in this day and age very much, but it's something that we have to put back on the table. And I think we can do that if we have a vision that's so amazing of what this future world looks like that we want to get at. And, you know, in a sense, it would be like announcing to our human family, you know, we're going to take a time out, you know, for 10 or 15 years. We're going to reconstruct our society so that it's fully regenerative. And, you know, in that time, we're going to build deeper communities. You know, we're going to, you know, have this shift in values, and we're going to work together on this. I think it's possible. And we also know that there have been times in the past when human societies have rallied on this scale. So for instance, the United States, after Pearl Harbor, in 3 months redirected all of its factory production to wartime and taxed the wealthiest members of the population at something like over 90% to take all those resources for the collective goal that everybody had agreed on was necessary. So we're actually, in that circumstance now. It's just that it's a more invisible situation because it's something that we've created through our, in a sense, ironically, through our incredible success as a species, through our progress and our industrial might, in a sense. So that's the energy aspect of it, and we know that solar has now reached grid parity with fossil fuels. We know that we have storage systems, the Internet of Energy, and all these pieces of this infrastructure are evolving rapidly. Yeah, I guess. Potentially this is something like an evolutionary process, like the development of fetus or in the womb in a sense, and we're kind of in that birth canal now where we only see the dark side of it, but the bright side of it would be the potential of making this social system, infrastructural, and consciousness shift in the time that we have available, if that makes sense. And in terms of industry, the alternative model is pointed out by somebody like William McDonough, who wrote the book Cradle to Cradle. Do people here know that book? Yeah, so he talks about how ultimately we don't have to have a negative ecological footprint. We could even have a positive one. I mean, we could have all of our packaging could be compostable and have like seeds and spores embedded in it. So you eat an ice cream wrapper, you bury the wrapper, and a garden springs up. He suggests there could be a really deep transition in our industrial manufacturing paradigm and our waste footprint. Agriculture, we know that we have to make a rapid transition away from industrial farming back to other practices like no-till agriculture, permaculture, organic farming, partially because industrial farming is putting a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, and it's also depleting soil to the point where the UN says that we won't be able to do farming like this in 60 years. So the time would be now to make that type of transition. And once again, it's a mind shift because we would have to have a lot more people doing gardening, doing farming again, and kind of the thrust of modernization has been, people are abandoning the countrysides, they're all going to move to the city where they're going to live much more interesting jobs, have much more interesting lives, and work as Uber drivers or in factories or whatever. And so now, in a way, we need to reverse the polarity of that logic and think about how we would resettle people back in the countrysides to grow more of their own food, but maybe in communities that are multi-generational, that are designed in such a way that they're not like cut off from the mainstream of culture, but actually are expressions of the highest potential that we have. So that's kind of the technical aspects of, does that make sense, all that? Okay, cool. So, then we'd have to think about, what are the social changes that we have to make in the political and economic areas, right? So, one of the big problems we have right now is our global financial system is basically just driving us towards destruction. It's like a suicide system. And this is because essentially, corporations, which I think you can look at positively as the most, incredible social technologies that humans have ever created. They're able to take energy, ideas, a legal code, and make, world-transforming kind of projects out of them, really quickly. It's pretty amazing. But the problem is that I guess you could look at a corporation as something like an artificial life form, and so we've constructed these amazing mechanisms made of human beings, and we've injected those life forms into a game that we also constructed called the stock market. And in that game of the stock market, we give them only one prime directive, which is that they have to maximize financial value or shareholder profit. So in a sense, you can't even really blame a corporation. Maybe you can hold the individuals accountable for sure, but you can't really blame a corporation for acting destructively because by the logic of that system, they're kind of forced to evade environmental restrictions, corrupt governments, hire lobbyists, because all they can do is maximize financial value. That's the prime directive that we've given them. So yeah, so ultimately I think we're going to have to change to, if we want to survive much longer as a species, the underlying logic of the financial system. And then, we could talk about how we would go about doing that. I mean, it might be there are ways through blockchain, this whole cryptocurrency area. There may also be the need for something like an intervention, like a World Social Forum meetup, where we're actually introducing this new economic system, where corporations go from what they are now to more like cooperative infrastructures that are not just about financial profit, but also about enhancing the biodiversity of local ecosystems and ensuring the integrity of local communities. Yes, that's a whole area. I mean, I think it goes beyond the B Corp model. And in terms of the government, I think we'd also, one thing I wanted to say about corporations also is another way to look at corporations, I think, is if we think about humanity as a giant organism collectively that's in a symbiotic relationship with the ecology of the earth as a whole system, then I think in a strange way corporations are like the organs. They're like the nascent organs in our collective body, right? So like an energy company is kind of like the blood or the circulation system that's taking energy and putting it through the whole system. A media company is like our perceptual mechanisms, which are taking in the raw sense data and converting it to the memes that then the whole organism kind of programs itself upon, and uses those memes and how it behaves. So our media, at this point, is sort of like programs subjectivity, produces consciousness on a global scale by telling people, how they respond to authority, what consumer goods they should buy, why they should feel status anxiety and so on, what types of relationships are appropriate to them. So the media, in a sense, is producing and reproducing subjectivity on a global scale. I know that's a little bit ironic because we tend to think of subjectivity as just what we are, but actually I think in a way it's much more socially engineered than that if you really think about most people in their response to culture and media and so on. And so that in a way is a frightening thought, but I think it's also an exciting thought because it means that we could potentially repurpose media to construct different subjectivities that are more participatory, that are more engaged, that are really focused on resilience and regeneration as their goals, in a sense. And then in terms of the governments, there once again, I think we have to see that the governments that we have now are expressions and artifacts of 18th century technology, right? Consciousness, right? Like the U.S. government was created in the late 18th century when information moved at horse and buggy speed. That was as fast as ideas could transmit. And now information moves, instantaneously, and innovation moves super quickly. So I think we have to ask ourselves whether these current governing structures are reformable. I mean, it might be that they become something like vestigial organs in the same way like the aristocracies of Europe continue to exist after the bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century. But we have to think about what replaces that. And once again, I think that the internet, it really shows us that we could have something like a direct democracy where everybody is able to participate and learn. It could be used as a learning and participation and decision-making engine for humanity in a much deeper way. And I feel in a way we've been kind of fooled by Facebook and Google have taken that potential and kind of trapped it. You think about Facebook as 2 billion people a day using that instrument, but you're very limited in what you can do on it. I mean, I started a group, I had a company and a nonprofit called Revolver. We have 3.5 million people on our Revolver social movement group, but we can't get them to vote on anything. We can't say to those 3 million people, hey guys, do you want to like boycott Monsanto? Hey you guys want to like stop using single-use plastic bags? Imagine if these tools were allowing people to organize their people power, in a way. So we see the power of these tools, but in our present framework, they've been like subverted by the financial and corporate structure and turned into tools of domination, and even accelerating the negative aspects of capitalism and patriarchy and all that stuff. Oh, I have 1 minute and 36 seconds left. Sorry about that. I was just getting going. But anyway, that's a lot of it. I mean, in terms of consciousness, as I mentioned, I think the media is really primary. And we really have to think about, how we kind of reprogram consciousness, construct different subjectivities. I mean, I heard a brilliant talk last week from a behavioral scientist and MIT group. There's a group called Beyond Conflict, and they're studying, we sort of have to reprogram ourselves and everybody else in different ways to react to different cues, to respond to different cues, and so on. And yes, but that's possible. The more that we learn about how our brains function, how we have, our cognitive biases, how those function, we can then find workarounds. So they were, for instance, they were talking about how they did a study where they were talking to people in general about, about 9/11. Did they feel, ordinary people in the U.S. did they feel that, anybody Muslim was somewhat responsible for 9/11? And many people said yes. And then they would point towards a truck bomb in Nevada that some white Christian had did, and they would say, well, you're Christian, do you feel responsible for this truck bomb? And they would say, of course not. Then they'd say, okay, well, if you're a Muslim engineer working in Portland, how are you responsible for 9/11? And then they would go, oh, that makes sense. So there are a lot of ways that we can, now that we understand how cognitive bias functions, and so on, that we can work around that, potentially through media and so on. So those are some of the things I wanted to talk about, but certainly not all of them. I do want to say that we have to think about, because we really we're in this very tremendously dire circumstance in many ways, and we have to ask ourselves what's going to be the leverage if we're going to break out of it. And I do think that one thing that's happening right now, the rise of female consciousness, this Me Too movement, is something that if it continues to grow, could become something that really shakes down and helps to kind of bring down the patriarchal systems. And I think we really have to see that that's a really powerful thing. I was going to read a few. There's a beautiful essay by this woman, Caitlin Johnston, that just went up on Medium. And I'm just going to read a little piece from that. She writes, this is not a political or ideological revolution. This is a complete undoing of all that is sick in this world, coming not from our minds, but from deep within ourselves. A voice has finally been given to the heritage of pain, which has been passed from mother to daughter, from generation to generation, as we taught one another how to survive in a world of sexual slavery since the dawn of civilization. It will not be pretty when it first comes out. It will not be sexy. It will not dance for male sexuality as it has been trained to do, like a good little girl. It will roar and it will destroy. Change is coming. What looks like women talking about their experiences with rape culture is actually a vast area of endarkened human unconsciousness suddenly becoming enlightened into consciousness. A whole section of our collective consciousness, which we have never previously had access to, is now suddenly becoming available to us. The old structures will not be able to stand on this new ground as they were built upon the old ground. I think that's very, very powerful, and I think is very hopeful. Even though it's obviously going to cause a lot of transformation and breakdown, but we kind of need to break down at this point so we can rebuild in some way, because we obviously can't continue in this manner. And I hope at some point that enlightening of that dark part of consciousness will then also transition over to an awareness that everybody is imprisoned by the system. Men and women, are both, have been imprisoned and suffer from it. Women in this more existential way, but men also in the limitation it imposes on their developments and so on. And then the next iteration level of that would be what this means in terms of our dealing with our environment and our social systems. And hopefully that can happen quickly, so we can move, to truth and reconciliation, between the genders, so we can work together to bring about this next level of transformation that has to happen in a brief period of time. I guess those are my thoughts for now. Does anybody want to ask a question? I've gone over a little bit, but if anybody has yeah.
Hi. So my question is more on the culture side, and when look at kind of how disengaged kind of most people are, and like I think it's something like 87% of the global workforce is like disengaged by this Gallup study, right? And I agree with the importance of a vision, and that's important, but like, what's your understanding, like, if we say, like, lit up that other 87% with their soul's purpose, like, what could be possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to do that, but I mean, I think, like, I guess I could consider that the individuals in our society, have suffered like 3 core wounds in their early development that make them detached and disengaged. And it's the political wound of feeling totally disempowered and detached, like you have no capacity to change the situation. It's the spiritual wound of feeling that the world is kind of nihilistic and meaningless and it's just a materialist mechanism. And then it's also the sexual wound of how patriarchy conditions people. So I guess somehow making the collective aware that we've been collectively wounded and disempowered in these ways, and then once again sort of saying to our human family, okay, we now recognize this, like consciousness has moved into this area, and we're now going to figure out the pathway to emancipate ourselves from this darkness. So healing, what's that? You're saying like healing? Yeah, but healing can only happen when you're really aware of what needs to be healed, yeah, I mean, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, healing and kind of self-discovery kind of go hand in hand. I mean, they kind of dance with each other a little bit, both kind of journeys towards wholeness. But I guess what I'm more interested in, like, let's say that, we get all these, Mikey and all.
As I said, I mean, I think the thing is that there needs to be more. This idea of higher purpose is nice. I don't like the word higher, actually, because I think higher and lower create also hierarchical ideas in our minds. But what is the purpose? I mean, for me, it has to be, reconstructing our civilization, breaking down this patriarchal domination system, and creating a truly regenerative culture, or regenerative society, right? Like that has to be the purpose. What else could it be, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, collective. Yeah.
How does purpose connect with initiation? And what are ways that you have witnessed people going through initiations as similar to finding purpose? And what are ways you recommend for us to expand the initiatory potential or purpose-finding potential of this moment?
Yeah, so this is a new rubric for me. I mean, I haven't been part of the purpose movement, and I think it's a beautiful word, but I guess I'm also wondering still, like, what is it pointing towards? So and what I would say is that it has to be pointing towards creating a regenerative society. I mean, what else can we do at this point, right? And then we have to think about what that is, and people have different purposes, I guess, within that. I thought that Ken Wilber's points this morning were really brilliant about the difference between waking up and growing up, and that we need both, and initiation should be both, and in a way, like, I remember I was very, it's very similar to what he said before about states and traits. Like, the problem with psychedelics, for instance, is that you have these experiences of these, euphoric or blissful or, intensified visionary states, but then how do you convert those into more permanent character traits? And it does feel like that's part of what, when I look over to the side here, whatever these things are, like that's part of what this culture is trying to do, is create those support structures so that we go from states to traits, or from waking up to growing up, Was that sort of an answer?
Follow up?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Patterns of finding purpose, to me, are similar to patterns of initiating ourselves. And so if we are amidst a global initiation, do you see patterns of ways people can assist this initiatory process. Because if the purpose is creating a regenerative culture, cultures need to initiate themselves into that purpose. Like, are you seeing ways that people are coming into adulthood that you recommend? Is that making sense?
I don't know. I mean, you know,
what are ways we initiate ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the waking up process, it could be meditation or yoga or ayahuasca, shamanism. You know, I've seen many people go through these processes using those types of tools. But I think that sometimes, because we don't have a larger kind of coherence of the field around what comes next, that I think has to be a little bit less vague than just higher purpose. You know, we need to spec it out. That's what I tried to do in the book, for better or worse. You know, I gave it a shot. You know, so it, you know, like, and then we have to really go deep into the inquiry. Like, I don't think, you know, like somebody, you know, like for instance, I don't think that we have to even question something like private property. You know, can we continue with private property and ever have an ecologically resilient, you know, human system? You know, I'm actually not sure that we can, frankly, because I think in a world of haves and have-nots, you know, you have the have-nots feel disenfranchised, and the haves end up focusing on protecting what they got. You know, so you know that's like a, you know, it's like deep inquiry into system and structure. You know, I think has to be part of the purpose at this point. You know, yeah. I can hear you anyway.
So, where are you seeing the regenerative edge and demonstration of? So I'm asking about where you see the regenerative edge and application or demonstration of regenerative activity, culture, communities.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I know a bunch of, you know, communities that are seeking to develop, you know, kind of templates and models. In, you know, Costa Rica, there's one in Portugal called Tamara, which I visited several times, tamara.org, and they began 35 years ago, started by German radicals who they were trying to understand why the promise of the utopian movements of the 60s failed, and they actually began to realize that it was core issues around love and sexuality that were not yet ready to be brought up into consciousness and addressed. So they created like a new social design. You know, now it involves permaculture and alternative technologies. That's one model. There's communities I know starting in Costa Rica and New Zealand. On the technology side, there's some brilliant projects. I mean, you know, I'm not a Luddite. Like, I think we need to also interrogate our naive faith in technology, and I think there is, like, you know, a progress trap where each layer of new technology that we create to try to deal with what we've, you know, already messed up with our past technologies, like, that's not a good way forward necessarily. But, you know, like James Ehrlich is a Stanford engineer who's created these regen villages. So the idea is you can have, you know, mass manufacturable housing units that have, you know, composting, aquaponics, energy, built into them. And so, so then, like, because we can guarantee in the next 10 or 20 years there's going to be more refugee populations, you know, more climate refugees. What are we going to do with all these people? You know, if we can figure out how they can be self-sufficient rather than just stuck in these, you know, kind of refugee camps, that's obviously going to be much preferable. You know, what we're learning on the cutting edge of the science of psychedelics, like you know, MDMA as a treatment tool for post-traumatic stress disorder, that seems like something that, once again, is still marginal now. But when we think about the amount of trauma that's going to happen with, you know, the ecological crisis, even if we now turn our attention, as we need to do, to addressing it much more directly, you know, tools like that are, I think, are going to be more like necessities in the near future. So yeah, I mean, biochar, you know, using drones to plant forests. There's a company that can plant like a million trees in a few days using drones. You know, so why not use what we can of this high technology to reverse the destruction or enhance our resilience. You know, so those are some of the areas that I see. What about you?
Great question.
Well, you asked it.
I know. Well, you know, I think I've been hearing it's kind of this regenerative word used for probably the last 5 years, and a lot of you know, communities that are starting to move towards that. And I'm seeing like Tribalize is a community that's coming together with more of the kind of the shelter and new forms of community forming, as an example. But I'm really looking now at some larger scale demonstration projects that don't look like an intentional community from the past, but are really like taking the most cutting edge stuff, like James has done with Regen Villages, and applying that at scale somewhere, and then playing with the governance structures that, you know, that you're talking about that are enabled now by blockchain, like a 2018 application of the most advanced technology that we have, you know, in a community at scale of, I don't know, 3,000 or something like that, where it's like, it's complex, really testing the technologies, and I don't know that we're past the kind of ideation phase to the deployment phase yet, and I'm trying to kind of find the other ships in the ocean that are...
There was Democracy OS, which was an idea, it's like a, you know, democratic tool, decision-making tool for, you know, urban environments, for cities, where you can proxy your votes to people, but you can also take the vote away right away if you don't like what they're doing with it. That seems like a really fascinating model. I mean, it feels like if we're going to, you know, get through this bifurcation point, it's like not going to be like incremental reform. It's going to be like, you know, like hitting the jackpot, like exponential, scalable technologies and tools that start to get implemented as these old systems are collapsing around us.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Daniel. I'm interested in the subject of deconstructing purpose and privilege. I remember you talked earlier about Rudolf Steiner at some point, and I believe that there was a social threefolding concept where there was the encouragement to be aware of how the economic sphere in some ways can take over the political and the cultural sphere. Like Terence McKenna saying, culture is not our friend, he probably had an awareness of that. So now that there's the encouragement to know that purpose is no longer just a self-help exercise, and it needs to be recontextualized within a regenerative culture, what would you say about the connection between purpose and privilege, where something like 10% of basically 90% of the world's resources may be connected with 10% of the population? So how would you look at the repurposing of wealth so that there's a letting go of the kind of attachment to the idea of ownership and possession, and equating that with the way we look at wealth?
That's a great question. I mean, you know, it's definitely the case, as we talked a little bit outside, that a lot of people who are kind of the bearers of inherited wealth, for instance, suffer from like tremendous suppressed guilt, you know, and that ends up leading to patterns like substance abuse, you know, and we know that past a certain financial threshold, you know, more wealth and more opportunity doesn't really make people happy. And we have more of the science of happiness. So we know that, you know, more human connection, more rootedness truly makes people happy. So I guess in a way we need to sort of, you know, support them in the process of recognizing that, you know, for the benefit of our human family and for the future of the planet as a whole, you know, they kind of need to use that resource right now to bring about this transformation. And obviously what we want to see is a world that works better for everybody. And there's no reason we can't get there. And we have the technical capacities. This is what Buckminster Fuller saw in the 60s with Utopia or Oblivion. You know, it may be that we have to go through a bumpy road for a few decades, you know, but that is the initiation, and that is our great opportunity. It's our mission if we're willing to accept it. And that goes for the wealthy elite as well as the poor. And, you know, and I do, you know, meet some people at the very highest echelon who understand that, you know, and are trying to figure out the best way to make use of their resources, you know, to assist in that transformation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.